1776 13 colonies on the edge of a vast empire declared independence. Most of the world assumed the rebellion would be crushed within a year. Instead, it created the nation now known as United States and permanently weakened Great Britain. This was not supposed to happen. On this channel, we examine the moments when history did not follow the script, when disciplined decisions, quiet systems, and long-term thinking reshaped the world more than dramatic battlefield heroics ever could. Because this story is not just about a war of independence. It is about why the most powerful empire on earth failed to keep control of territory it had already conquered, and why a fragile coalition of colonies managed to outlast a global superpower. At first glance, the American Revolution looks inevitable, a rising people throwing off tyranny, a new nation born from courage, but nothing about it was inevitable. By the mid-18th century, Great Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, defeating France and gaining vast territories in North America. Britain controlled the seas, commanded enormous financial resources, and possessed one of the most professional armies in the world. The colonies, by contrast, had no unified government, no national army, no navy, and no reliable funding system. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. The empire was not weak. It was exhausted. War had left Britain deep in debt. London needed revenue, and the colonies, prosperous and lightly taxed, seemed the obvious source. New laws imposed duties on paper, tea, and trade. From the British perspective, this was administrative housekeeping. From the colonial perspective, it felt like control tightening. Tensions rose in cities like Boston, where protests escalated from boycotts to violence. British troops were deployed not to conquer, but to maintain order, yet their presence made the conflict visible, personal, daily. Still, even then, independence was not the dominant goal. Most colonial leaders wanted rights within the empire, not separation from it. Everything changed in April 1775. At dawn near Lexington and Concord, British troops marched to seize colonial weapons stockpiles. They expected resistance to dissolve quickly. Instead, local militias mobilized with surprising speed. The confrontation that followed was chaotic, confused, and brief. But as British forces retreated toward Boston, thousands of armed colonists harassed them from behind trees, walls, and houses. It was not a decisive military defeat. It was something more dangerous. It proved that ordinary civilians were willing to fight imperial troops, not in organized battle lines, but in a prolonged, decentralized struggle. Britain could win engagements and still lose control of the countryside. Soon after, the colonies created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. Washington was not chosen because he was the best battlefield tactician. He was chosen because he understood something more important: survival. He knew the colonies did not need to defeat Britain in traditional warfare. They only needed to avoid defeat long enough for British political will to collapse. This became the core strategy of the revolution, not conquest, but endurance. Meanwhile, Britain faced a logistical nightmare. Supplying troops across the Atlantic required months of planning and vulnerable shipping routes. Every musket, uniform, and ration had to cross an ocean patrolled by storms and enemies, and Britain was not fighting in empty land. It was fighting inside a populated territory roughly the size of Western Europe, where hostile locals could disrupt supply lines constantly. Early in the war, British commanders believed capturing major cities would end the rebellion. They seized New York, then Philadelphia, expecting colonial resistance to crumble. It didn't, because the revolution was not centered on cities. It was spread across farms, towns, and wilderness. The war dragged on. Then came a turning point that shocked Europe. In 1777, British General John Burgoyne led an army south from Canada, aiming to split the colonies in two. The plan relied on coordination between multiple forces, coordination that never materialized. Surrounded near Saratoga, Burgoyne surrendered. Militarily, it was significant. Politically, it was transformative. For France, this was proof the rebellion might succeed. And France did not need to love the colonies to support them. It only needed to weaken Britain, its longtime rival. French money, weapons, troops, and naval power began flowing across the Atlantic. Suddenly, this was no longer a colonial uprising. It was a global war. British strategy now had to stretch across the Caribbean, India, the Mediterranean, and European waters. The empire's greatest strength, its worldwide reach, became a liability. Resources were divided. Attention was diluted. Meanwhile, Washington continued avoiding catastrophic defeat. He lost battles. He retreated often. He endured brutal winters with underfed soldiers and expiring enlistments. To critics, it looked like failure. To Washington, it was preservation. If the army survived, the revolution survived. The decisive moment came years later in Virginia. By 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis moved his forces to the coastal town of Yorktown, expecting naval support to secure his position. It was a logical move unless the sea itself could no longer be controlled. The Royal Navy had dominated the Atlantic for generations, but now French fleets contested that dominance. In September 1781, a French fleet blocked British ships from entering Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis was trapped. Washington and French General Rochambeau marched south, surrounding the British army on land, while French ships sealed the escape route by sea. This was not a dramatic charge. It was a perfectly aligned system of cooperation. Siege lines tightened. Artillery pounded British defenses. Supplies dwindled. Escape became impossible. Cornwallis surrendered. The military loss was significant but not catastrophic in isolation. Britain still had armies elsewhere. Its homeland was secure. Its empire remained vast. But politically, the war had become too expensive, too distant, and too uncertain. Public support in Britain eroded. Parliament shifted. Negotiations began. In 1783, Britain recognized American independence, not because it had been utterly defeated, but because continuing the war no longer made strategic sense. This is the quiet truth behind the revolution. The colonies did not overpower Britain in direct combat. They made victory too costly to pursue, and in doing so, they created something unprecedented, a large republic built not from ancient tradition or dynastic rule, but from negotiated union. The consequences were enormous. The success of the United States proved that European empires were not invincible across oceans. It inspired independence movements throughout the Americas. It forced Britain to rethink how it governed colonies, eventually shifting toward systems of self-rule within the empire. It also altered global power balances. A nation that began as a fragile coalition would, over the next century, expand across a continent, and eventually emerge as a superpower influencing every major conflict of the modern era. But none of that was guaranteed in 1776. At any point, a lost army, a failed alliance, a naval disaster, political collapse, the rebellion could have ended quietly remembered as a brief colonial uprising rather than the birth of a nation. Instead, discipline overcame impulse. Patience outlasted power. Strategy defeated assumption. The United States did not steal freedom in a sudden act. It accumulated it slowly by surviving long enough that the empire holding it could no longer justify the effort to keep it. History often celebrates decisive victories, but sometimes the world changes because one side simply refuses to disappear. And that may be the most uncomfortable lesson of all. Superpowers are rarely destroyed in a single blow. They are worn down until holding on costs more than letting go. If you want to understand how today's world was shaped, you have to look at moments like this when outcomes were uncertain, when systems mattered more than speeches, and when endurance quietly rewrote the future. If there's another historical turning point you think deserves this kind of deep dive, share it in the comments. And if you value calm, serious explorations of the decisions that changed history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Because the past is not just a record of what happened, it is a map of how power rises, how it falters, and how new worlds begin.